The day began before the sun did, as it always had, and as it always would. A faint gray light seeped through the cracks in the curtains, brushing against the uneven floorboards and the sleeping dust that had gathered through the night. Outside, the world was neither awake nor asleep, existed in that slow pause between darkness and dawn. The cobblestones of the narrow Victorian street lay slick with dew, cold and glistening like dull mirrors of a life too ordinary to notice itself. The first footsteps belonged to the milkman, his boots striking the stones with the soft rhythm of someone who had done the same thing yesterday, and the day before that, and would do it again tomorrow without question. The horses stirred lazily in their stalls, their breaths visible in the frosty air, steam rising like small ghosts of effort. Nothing hurried, nothing needed to dot in those cold mornings. The air had a weight to it, kind of quiet, that wasn't peaceful, but resigned. The houses stood shoulder to shoulder, built of the same soot-darkened brick, their chimneys exhaling tired wisps of smoke into the sky. The city itself seemed to breathe, slow and heavy, like an old man who had seen too much but had forgotten why it mattered. The sounds were simple and predictable: a door creaking open, a cartwheel rolling over uneven stones, the muffled murmur of a woman calling her children to rise. Even the birds sang lazily, as if they too were aware that nothing new ever happened here. For the ordinary Victorian, morning was not a beginning. It was a continuation, the same breakfast, the same walk, the same fog pressing gently against one's face like a damp blanket. The men wore thick coats with collars turned high, and the women wrapped shawls around their shoulders, moving through the street with baskets in hand. Children trailed behind, rubbing their eyes, their breath mixing with the mist. Every step was deliberate, unhurried, and strangely synchronized, though the entire street shared a single slow heartbeat. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang, its tone deep and familiar, reminding everyone of the time they already knew too well. The cobblestones were witnesses to all of it. They carried the weight of footsteps and wheels, of horses and carriages, of lives that came and went without leaving much behind. Each stone was worn smooth by repetition, and if you listened closely, it seemed they whispered of all the mornings that had passed exactly like this one. The fog thickened as the sky turned from black to pale gray, the kind of gray that refused to commit to light. Gas lamps flickered softly, still burning though the sun was near, their weak glow bending in the mist like tired eyes that couldn't stay open. It was a beautiful sort of dullness, gentle, predictable, and safe in its sameness. Inside the narrow houses, fires were lit in small iron grates. The sound of crackling coal mixed with the faint hiss of boiling kettles. The smell of tea leaves and toasted bread drifted through the rooms, wrapping around the wooden furniture and lace curtains. Mothers moved quietly, their dresses brushing the floor as they set tables for family members who rarely spoke during breakfast. Fathers adjusted their cuffs and checked pocket watches that never seemed to move fast enough. Children stirred porridge without interest, staring blankly at the patterns in their bowls. No one complained, because there was nothing to complain about. It was life, ordinary and unchanging, and it had a rhythm that comforted even as it numbed. When the men left for work, they walked the same cobbled path that their fathers had walked, and their sons would one day follow. The factory whistle blew far in the distance, its echo stretching through the fog like a tired sigh. Horses pulled carts loaded with coal and crates, their hooves clopping steadily, marking the slow passing of another day's beginning. Shopkeepers swept the fronts of their stores, the brooms scratching gently against the stones. The sky brightened, but never fully cleared. The light remained soft and colorless, as though the sun itself was reluctant to rise. Even beauty seemed too polite to be vivid. Here it preferred to whisper, not shout. There was a strange peace in such monotony. The Victorians didn't seek excitement, they sought endurance. To live meant to continue, to repeat, to maintain a quiet dignity in the face of the same day returning again and again. The cobblestones didn't care who walked upon them, only that someone did. They had known laughter and sorrow, birth and death, love and indifference in equal measure, all fading equally into the fog. And so the morning went on. Milk bottles clinked, chimney smoke thickened, and somewhere a clock struck 8. It was a signal that work awaited, that breakfast was over, that life, in all its dull persistence, had begun once more. Even the air seemed tired of being breathed, heavy with the damp scent of coal, iron, and bread. Yet within that heaviness there was something soothing, almost hypnotic. It was the rhythm of a city that had accepted its fate to move forward slowly, to live without spectacle, to find comfort in the ordinary. The cobblestones, cold and unchanging, were not just a path beneath the people's feet. They were the foundation of their patience, the unspoken reassurance that tomorrow would be just like today, and that was enough. And as the fog began to lift, revealing more of the street, nothing really changed. The same figures moved along the same paths, carrying the same burdens and the same hopes. A carriage rattled by, leaving a faint echo that faded almost immediately into the mist. Life continued, quietly, steadily, without surprise or regret. The Victorians didn't chase dreams. They carried them like invisible weights tucked away beneath their coats. The city, vast and weary, sighed as another morning fully arrived, a morning indistinguishable from any other. And that was precisely what made it timeless. There was a time when the sound of horse hooves was the heartbeat of every Victorian street, slow and deliberate, echoing through the narrow lanes like a soft percussion against the cobblestones. In the calm of early morning and the dull hush of late afternoon, that sound filled the silence, not loud enough to disturb, but steady enough to remind the people that life was still moving, gently, endlessly, predictably. The hooves struck rhythmically, a sound too ordinary to be noticed by those who lived among it every day, yet too constant to ever fade completely. It was not just transportation. It was the sound of existence itself in the Victorian city, a slow, unchanging symphony of hooves, wheels, and breath in the damp air. The fog would roll through the streets like a sleepy blanket, wrapping around the figures of drivers and horses until they looked like faint ghosts in motion. The air smelled of wet stone, hay, and coal smoke. Each carriage creaked in time with the hooves that pulled it, a tired partnership between man and beast. The drivers wore long coats and heavy gloves, faces hidden beneath hats, their voices low and unhurried. They spoke softly to their horses, guiding them through the maze of streets they knew by heart. Nothing hurried. Even urgency moved slowly here. A man could walk from one end of the neighborhood to another and hear the same sound repeating without pause, the endless clop 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 that marked the rhythm of an age. Before engines, before noise, before haste, children walking to school would sometimes count the hoofbeats as they crossed the road, their small boots leaving prints on the wet stones. Shopkeepers, standing by their doors, would glance up only briefly as a carriage passed, nodding to the driver before turning back to sweep the same dust that would return an hour later. The horses' breath came in slow clouds of mist, their eyes calm, their movements patient. They were creatures of habit, mirroring the humans who depended on them. The wheels of carriages creaked, metal rims scraping lightly against the uneven stones, and for a brief moment it seemed the whole world was made of soft sound and gentle motion. For the ordinary Victorian, the sound of horse hooves was as familiar as the ticking of a clock or the beating of one's own heart. It was background music to daily life, unremarkable, yet deeply woven into every routine. Lovers walked side by side under the faint glow of gas lamps, their words half swallowed by the rhythm of passing horses. A woman drawing water from a pump could tell the time by the pattern of carriages that rolled past the baker's cart at dawn, the merchant's wagon before noon, the postal coach by afternoon, and the quiet emptiness that came when night settled in. The hooves told stories without words, marking the slow pulse of a world content in its monotony. In the wealthier parts of the city, polished carriages moved with elegance, their wheels trimmed with gold, horses groomed to perfection. In the poorer lanes, the wagons were worn, their wooden sides scarred by years of use, their horses older and slower, their harnesses patched and faded. Yet, no matter the class or purpose, all hooves sounded the same on the cobblestones, equal in rhythm, equal in weariness. The city itself was a vast orchestra of sameness, every beat blending into the next until time blurred softly away. Sometimes, when the fog thickened so much that sight became useless, people would listen, truly listen to the hooves to guide their sense of place. A certain echo might tell them of a wide street ahead, another might reveal the narrow bend near the market. The sound had its geography, its familiar map made of rhythm and space. It was the city speaking in slow, steady notes, and though it said nothing new, it said it with such persistence that it became part of every life that moved through it as the day stretched on. The hooves never stopped, though their tones shifted with the changing air. Morning hooves were crisp and sharp, afternoon ones heavier and duller, softened by the dust that gathered. At dusk, the rhythm slowed, not by will, but by weariness. Horses moved more carefully, their breath deeper, their steps measured. The lamplighter passed by, touching flame to glass, one post at a time, and the orange glow shimmered faintly on the wet stones below. The sound of hooves echoed against that light, one small reminder that the day, though ordinary, had lived. For those listening from their windows, it was comforting. The sound meant the city was alive, that even if they sat alone in dim rooms, life went on outside. A woman sewing by the fire could hear the distant rhythm and feel less alone. A child, drifting to sleep, could imagine a horse trotting through dreams, carrying quiet through the night. And when the rain came, soft and unhurried, the sound changed, but never vanished. It mixed with the rain, the gentle splash of hooves in puddles, creating a new kind of lullaby, one made for those who found peace in routine. in repetition, in the beautiful boredom of existence. Even the horses seemed to understand the role they played. They were not creatures of adventure, but of endurance. Their steady rhythm was their language, a patience that mirrored the people who lived beside them. And when finally the night deepened, when the last carriage passed and silence settled once more, the absence of hooves was louder than their sound had ever been. It was in that absence that people realized how much the noise had comforted them, the soft clatter of life continuing, unremarkable yet reassuring. And so the city slept, wrapped in fog and faint lamplight, dreaming of hooves that would return with the morning. Nothing dramatic, nothing urgent, just the slow, measured beat of another day waiting to begin. The Victorians may have called it ordinary, but within that ordinary there was a strange sort of grace, a rhythm that never tired, a sound that belonged to the very soul of time. Every Victorian morning stretched out like a corridor of fog and patience. Men and women stepped from their narrow doorways into the chill, boots pressing softly into the damp sheen that clung to the cobblestones. The air was neither warm nor cold enough to stinge it. Each walker began the same ritual, adjusting a scarf, pulling a cap low, tightening fingers inside worn gloves. There was little talk, little rush, only the slow migration of people toward the factories, offices, and workshops that waited like enormous clocks ready to swallow their hours. The long walk to work was not a journey of distance, but of acceptance, a quiet surrender to repetition. The rhythm of footsteps joined the familiar clatter of horses in the distance, merging into a slow heartbeat for the city. A thin light crept across windows, sliding over brick walls, still slick from the night's drizzle. The workers followed streets that wound like veins through the neighborhood, each turn learned by memory, not by thought. A man might pass the same bakery every morning, glance once at the same flickering lamp, and smell the same faint sweetness of dough that he could never afford to buy. Another might pause at the same corner to tie his bootlace, not because it was loose, but because routine demanded it. The city rewarded habit. Change was considered unnecessary decoration. As they walked, their eyes often stayed low, fixed on the stones beneath them. It was easier that there was little beauty above only soot-streaked walls and the endless gray of the sky. The sound of their own steps, steady and uniform, was a kind of comfort. Each person's pace matched the unseen rhythm of thousands more across the city, a collective march without music or command. The younger men walked with shoulders square, perhaps pretending the day held promise. The older ones moved slower, leaning slightly forward as though pressed down by invisible years. Even the children heading toward apprenticeship workshops mimicked their elders' weariness, learning early the art of endurance. Occasionally, a carriage would roll by, its wheels hissing over wet stones. Workers would step aside politely, not resentfully, and was too expensive to maintain. They would glance up just long enough to see a silhouette behind glass, then resume walking. The rich and the poor shared the same air, the same fog, the same tired sun that refused to shine fully. But their worlds touched only for that brief second when hooves met feet on the same road. Then separation returned, soft and inevitable. The walk was long, not because of distance, but because time itself seemed slower here. Minutes stretched thin, bending under the weight of monotony. A church bell would chime somewhere far off, its echo dissolving into mist. And for a fleeting moment, people lifted their heads to listen. It reminded them of movement, of progress, even if neither truly existed. The smell of factories drifted closer, iron, oil, and smoke blending into something almost metallic on the tongue. Some wiped their faces with cloths. Others simply breathed it in, already part of their lungs, part of who they were. Women carried baskets, balanced on their hips, filled with sewing, bread, or laundry to deliver. Their shoes were thin, their steps cautious on the slick ground. They passed men reading newspapers under dim light, their headlines printed in ink that smudged at the slightest touch. News of politics and empire mattered little here. What mattered was the clock, the unyielding, unblinking timepiece that ruled the day. It waited in every workshop and factory, its ticking hidden but felt, a quiet overseer of lives, measured not in dreams but in hours worked. Sometimes the fog would lift just enough to reveal a glimpse of the river. Workers walking along its edge might pause to watch the slow churn of water, thick with silt and smoke, reflecting nothing but a pale, blurred version of the sky. Barges moved soundlessly, carrying coal or timber, and then were swallowed again by haze. The city's pulse continued, indifferent and endless. A man could live 50 years here and still walk the same route, past the same walls, to the same door that creaked open to the same noise of machines. There was comfort in that certainty, even if it dulled the soul. When the wind blew, it carried the faint hum of machinery, the thrum of looms, the hiss of steam, the metallic clang of tools. The walkers heard it before they reached the gates, and with each step their pace slowed just slightly, as though preparing themselves for surrender. Conversation, if it happened at all, was soft, a greeting, a remark about weather, a shared cough that ended in silence. The streets absorbed these murmurs and offered nothing back. Only the echo of boots remained, a rhythm that felt older than the people making it. As the factories drew nearer, the light dimmed again, even though the morning had long begun. The high brick walls rose like cliffs, the windows blackened with soot. The air thickened, vibrating faintly with the beat of hidden engines. Men flicked ash from their pipes, women tightened shawls. There was no anticipation, only readiness, quiet willingness to continue what could not be escaped. A few glanced back once more at the foggy streets behind them, but the view was always the same. The walk would repeat tomorrow, and the day after, and the next, until the shoes wore down and the body followed. For those who truly listened, there was music in its low hum of collective movement, the slow melody of boots on stone, the sigh of air through narrow alleys. It was the song of the ordinary, simple and endless, played in every city of the age. The Victorians didn't rush toward the future. They walked toward it one dull, steady step at a time. And perhaps that was the secret of their endurance. In a world of fog and routine, they found a rhythm too quiet to tire of, too familiar to forget. The long walk to work was not only a journey through streets, but through history itself, an unbroken line of motion that connected yesterday to tomorrow without needing change. By the time the first whistles blew, by the time the gates opened and swallowed the workers whole, the streets fell silent again. Only a few latecomers hurried through the fading mist, their breaths short and visible. Soon even they would vanish behind brick and smoke, leaving the cobblestones empty once more. The city inhaled, exhaled, and waited for evening, when the same feet would return along the same road, carrying the same tired silence home. The homes of ordinary Victorians were small boxes of quiet, built close together as if seeking warmth from one another. Behind every narrow doorway waited a breath of coal smoke and the muffled tick of a clock that rarely ran quite right. The rooms were narrow, their ceilings low, their walls layered in wallpaper that once had color, but now seemed to have forgotten it. Morning light, already weak outside, slipped through lace and dust, to fade entirely behind curtains so thick that they seemed made, not to block brightness, but to hold the house in a permanent twilight. The heavy fabric smelled faintly of soot and tea. When it moved, it did so reluctantly, dragging the air with it like something half-asleep. Inside these tiny rooms, time did not hurry. The fire hissed softly in the grate, burning small lumps of coal that glowed like buried embers in the dark. The furniture was sturdy, plain, and endlessly polished dark wood that shone where hands had rested for years. A small table, a few chairs, a cabinet crowded with chipped cups, that was enough. There was comfort in the weight of things that stayed still. The wallpaper, patterned with faded flowers, held the memory of smoke from 100 winter nights. Every object seemed to breathe a little, expanding and shrinking with the weather, groaning faintly as the house settled around it. The rooms smelled of life, lived slowly, damp wool drying by the fire, candle wax cooling on a saucer, bread crusts crisping in the oven. Footsteps echoed even when taken softly. There was no space large enough for sound to hide. Children's laughter, when it came, filled the entire house and spilled into the street. But most hours passed in low conversation or in silence, broken only by the creak of floorboards and the occasional cough. The city outside might roar with industry, but within these walls it whispered. The home was a cocoon of monotony, protecting its occupants from both excitement and despair. Each morning, the curtains were drawn back only halfway, letting in a slice of light that crossed the room like a pale bridge. The rest remained in comfortable dimness. Dust danced in that beam, small and aimless. Women moved quietly through it, shaking out tablecloths, straightening pictures, brushing ash from the hearth. The work was never done, but never urgent. There was always another plate to wash, another sock to mend, another floor to sweep. Routine hung heavier than the curtains themselves, but there was pride in keeping order, in making small spaces behave. A tidy home was a good defense against the chaos of the streets outside. The walls carried the faint hum of neighbors' muffled voices, the thump of someone moving a chair, the cry of a baby. Privacy was a fragile idea. Everyone heard everyone, and so everyone learned to pretend not to. In that shared quiet, people found a sort of companionship. The houses leaned together, their chimneys clustered like old men's shoulders, exhaling smoke in unison. From above, perhaps, the neighborhood looked like a single living thing, breathing slowly under the blanket of soot that settled day after day. Evening changed little except the light. When the sun sank, the curtains closed again, sealing the world inside. Candles were lit, tiny suns in glass holders. Then their glow made the shadows tremble gently along the walls. The family gathered near the hearth. The fire's crackle was the loudest sound. Someone read from a book in a low, careful voice. Someone else mended a shirt by touch more than sight. The rhythm of breathing, the occasional scrape of a chair leg, the sigh of coal shifting in the grate hall, these were the music of the Victorian home. It lulled the house like a lullaby, without melody. Winter deepened the stillness. Frost painted the window edges in white lace, more delicate than any curtain, but few looked at it for long. To open the window would be to let in the cold, and so the heavy fabric stayed drawn year after year, until its folds learned the shape of the room. The air thickened with warmth and the smell of people living close. It wasn't unpleasant. It was simply human, the scent of survival. The rooms seemed to hold their breath with the family, waiting for spring to loosen them again in richer districts. The same pattern repeated in slightly larger scale, more rooms, taller ceilings, heavier curtains, but the feeling remained. Even with chandeliers and velvet drapes, the stillness persisted. The Victorians prized restraint. They feared disorder. A calm, dim house was proof of respectability. The brightness of day was left for the factories. Home was for quiet, for measured conversation, and the endless ritual of maintaining propriety. The smaller the room, the tighter the hold of habit. And yet, the tighter the habit, the safer life felt. Sometimes, late at night, when the fire was only red dust and the last candle flickered, a listener might hear the city beyond the curtain, the distant bell of a carriage, the faint call of a watchman, the wind threading through alleys. These sounds reminded the sleepless that life continued elsewhere, but only faintly. The curtain dulled it, turned the world to a soft hum. The walls pressed in, not to trap, but to protect. Here, within these small enclosures, people dreamed modest dreams: a warmer winter, a better wage, a longer loaf of bread. The room itself seemed to dream with them. Morning would come again, as it always did. The same cold seeped through cracks, the same kettle hissed on the stove. The curtains would lift halfway, and the pale bridge of light would return to the same spot on the worn rug. Children would shuffle out from their shared beds. Adults would stir the fire back to life, and the day would begin without fanfare. There was peace in that predictability, a soft assurance that nothing truly terrible or extraordinary would happen today. Life, in its quiet way, continued exactly as expected, and so the tiny Victorian rooms remained, generation after generation, cubes of muted existence, sealed behind heavy fabric and careful manners. They were not grand, nor were they miserable. They were simply themselves, small, ordered, and endlessly repeating. To outsiders, they might have seemed dull, but to those who lived there, they were the whole world, perfectly contained behind curtains that let in only as much light as life required. In the ordinary Victorian home, the teapot was more than a utensil. It was the quiet heart of the day, the small sun around which every hour revolved. Morning, noon, or night, it sat at the center of the table, warm, weighty, and faintly breathing steam. The first sound in many households was not the clock or the rooster, but the low bubbling of water in a kettle coming to its slow, predictable boil. It was the kind of sound that neither hurried nor hesitated. It simply happened every day, exactly the same. The endless teapot ritual was the pulse of domestic life, steady enough to be invisible. When the fire was coaxed awake in the grate, a dull orange glow spread across the iron stove. A small tin kettle was placed on top, its surface blackened from years of use. While it heated, the house yawned into being. Curtains remained mostly closed. The half-light made everything soft. The air smelled faintly of ash and damp fabric. Then came the first scythe hiss and clatter as the kettle began to murmur. It was a signal understood without words. Women moved from room to room, collecting cups. Men unfolded newspapers. Children rubbed their eyes and found their places at the table. Nothing began until the water sang. The making of tea was almost ceremonial, though no one would have called it so. The spoon measured leaves with quiet precision, not too little, not too much. They fell like brown rain into the pot, dry and earthy. When the water finally boiled, it was poured in a slow, careful stream, and for a moment the room filled with a low cloud of fragrant steam. The smell was comfort itself, warm, familiar, faintly sweet. There were finer pleasures in the world, but none so certain. The lid was set back on the pot with a small click, and then began the waiting, the still minute or two when time seemed to pause out of respect. No one spoke loudly. Even the fire seemed too quiet. Its crackling while the tea steeped, pouring, was an art of patience. The liquid flowed amber and clear into cups already lined up like small, obedient soldiers. A spoon of sugar might swirl once or twice. A drop of milk might soften the color, but always with restraint. There was dignity in moderation. To drink tea was to agree, silently, that life was manageable, that chaos could be contained inside a china cup. The first sip warmed the throat, then the stomach, then something deeper that had nothing to do with hunger. It reminded people they were still themselves, that the day could be faced as it had been faced before. Even fatigued tasted better when washed down with ritual in working-class houses. The same act played out with fewer luxuries, but the same devotion. The pot might be metal instead of porcelain, the cups mismatched, the tea leaves used twice, yet the meaning remained. A laborer's wife might brew it before dawn, setting a cup by the door for her husband to drink before the long walk to the factory. He would wrap his hands around it for warmth, take one slow swallow, and step into the fog. The cup would be rinsed, refilled later, and the cycle would repeat. By the time evening came, the teapot would have cooled and been reheated 3 or 4 times, a quiet endurance equal to any engine in the city. In larger homes, the ritual grew grander, but not livelier. Silver pots replaced tin, servants poured instead of mothers, yet the air of calm repetition remained. The same gestures, the same measured voices, the same tapping of teaspoons against porcelainate was etiquette's most perfect form of boredom. Guests complimented the flavor, complimented the weather, and said nothing of substance. The tea filled the pauses between them, giving shape to silence. It was not conversation that connected them, but the shared act of sipping. Children learned the importance of it early. They were taught how to hold the cup properly, how not to slurp, how to stir without clinking too loudly. They learned that the teapot was to be treated with respect, almost reverence. To spill was to offend something sacred, though no one could name exactly what. Perhaps it was the idea of order itself, the notion that as long as the tea was made right, life would hold together. So they grew up repeating the gestures they had watched, and when they had homes of their own, they repeated them again. Thus the teapot passed down not as an heirloom, but as an instinct. The hours of the day were measured in cups. 1 before breakfast, one at mid-morning, one when the children returned from school, another after supper when the fire burned low. In moments of joy, tea steadied the nerves. In grief, it softened the edges of sorrow. When visitors arrived, the first words were not, "How are you?" but, "Shall I put the kettle on?" To refuse was almost unthinkable. To accept was to agree to sit, to pause, to exist within the gentle boundaries of routine. It was civility condensed into liquid form, even during storms. When wind rattled the windows and rain ran down the panes like cold fingers, the ritual continued. A candle might gutter, the fire might shrink, but the kettle still found its way to flame. The sound of boiling water rose above the storm's growl, stubborn and serene. Outside could rage, inside would steep. The Victorians did not fight the world's noise. They drowned it quietly in tea. By late evening, when the city's smoke settled and the last lamps dimmed, the final pot was poured. It was the gentlest farewell to the day. Hands wrapped around cups, not for taste now, but for warmth. Conversations slowed into murmurs. Eyes drooped, and the spoon resting in the sugar bowl caught the glow of the fire one last time. The pot was emptied, rinsed, and placed back in its place, ready to begin again when dawn returned. Nothing felt finished, only paused. The ritual was endless, because life itself was. Tomorrow would bring another kettle, another pour, another quiet affirmation that survival could still be beautiful. The endless teapot ritual was not about the drink, but about the silence between sips, the peace that existed in doing something perfectly ordinary and doing it well. It was the heartbeat of the Victorian home, constant, modest, and unchanging. In a world obsessed with progress and machines, it reminded people of something slower and more human, the warmth of breath, the curl of steam, the calm of repetition. In that sense, every home was a small temple, and the teapot its ever-smiling god. There was a strange kind of devotion in the way Victorians cleaned. Not passion, not pride, exactly something quieter, steadier. It was a discipline that filled the empty spaces between hours, a habit that gave shape to time itself. To clean was not to make something new, but to keep the world from slipping further into dust. The task never ended, and no one expected it to. Every morning began with a broom in hand, a cloth over the shoulder, and the familiar knowledge that by nightfall the same dirt would return again. But repetition had its comfort. It meant life was still moving, still manageable. When daylight filtered weakly through lace curtains, the first motion in the house was often a quiet rustle, the swish of a rag, the scrape of a chair being pulled aside, the dull sound of bristles brushing wood. The air carried the smell of coal smoke and soap, mingled with damp linen and the faint metallic scent of the bucket. Water sloshed softly as it was poured into basins, sometimes cold from the pump, sometimes faintly warm from the hearth. Fingers reddened in it, but no one complained. Cleanliness was a kind of faith, if not in God, then in order, in control, in the illusion that effort could keep decay away. Women scrubbed floors that had been scrubbed every day for years, their hands knowing every groove in the wood, every stubborn spot that refused to fade. The rag moved in small, circular motions, hypnotic, patient. They dusted mantelpieces that would gather soot again before evening, polished brass that dulled the moment it cooled. shook rugs that would soon enough be trodden with the same boots, returning from the same muddy streets. It was not futility, was rhythm. A slow, unspoken dance between human hands and the inevitability of grime. The house never truly became clean. It only became cleaner for a while, and that was enough. In wealthier homes, servants carried out the same rituals on a larger stage. Feather dusters swayed like metronomes beneath high ceilings. Footsteps echoed across tiled halls, and silver trays gleamed briefly before fingerprints found them again. Even in grandeur, the work was endless. The mistress might walk through the room afterward, running one white-gloved finger along a shelf. The servant would curtsy, murmur thanks, and begin again tomorrow. The gestures were as mechanical as the city's machines, yet more graceful because they were done by choice, by routine, by memory. The sound of cleaning filled the Victorian home like soft percussion. The sweep of the broom, the knock of the bucket, the faint squeak of cloth against glass. The rhythm soothed the air, breaking the silence without disturbing it. It was music for those who never had leisure to listen to any other kind. The house seemed to breathe with the movement, walls shifting faintly, furniture groaning as it was lifted and set back down, dust swirling like ghosts in the narrow beams of light. There was no hurry in the work. To clean properly was to move slowly, to let the day pass unnoticed, to let thoughts drift like the dust itself. Sometimes, in the middle of it, a woman might pause and look at the same spot she had scrubbed 1,000 times before. Her reflection might blur faintly in the window pane as she wiped it clear. She might think without really thinking about how long she had lived inside these walls, how many mornings had begun like this. And then she would lower her gaze and continue. Reflection had no place in the rhythm. Stillness was only allowed if it came disguised as work. In the soft repetition of cleaning, people forgot to measure life in years. They measured it in buckets, emptied, in cloths, wrung dry. In the faint ache of arms at day's end, children learned early to imitate their mother's motions. A girl might polish the small brass handle of a drawer, proud to see her own face reflected faintly in it. A boy might sweep the doorstep, scattering dust into the street. They didn't understand the purpose, only the pattern. And so the pattern continued, passed down quietly through generations. In the rhythm of cleaning, they found the rhythm of existence itself, slow, circular, never finished, never wasted. The Victorians loved the idea of purity, but their houses were built in cities thick with soot. Dust drifted down from chimneys, crept under doors, clung to curtains and hair alike. It could never be banished, only delayed. And so the act of cleaning became less about removing dirt than about proving persistence. To keep cleaning was to keep resisting. The world outside might crumble into factories and smoke, but inside, the floorboards still shone faintly. There was a kind of triumph in that evening changed the mood. When the last light dimmed and lamps were lit, the house smelled faintly of soap and iron. The bucket was emptied. The broom leaned against the wall, and the cloth hung to dry near the fire. The same hands that had scrubbed now poured tea, folded, mended clothes, stroked a child's hair. The quiet satisfaction was not in the result, but in the act itself. Tomorrow would undo everything, but tonight, for a few brief hours, the house was clean. The order restored was temporary, but it felt eternal. And so it went day after day, corner after corner, year after year. The same walls, the same stains, the same sigh of effort and release. What might sound dull to others was the heartbeat of life itself to those who lived it. In a time before convenience, before electricity, before ease, the act of maintaining one's space was a form of resilience. It said, "We are still here. We still care. The corners are clean, the lamps trimmed, the dust sent away, at least for now. Tomorrow, when it returns, so will we." The endless repetition was, in its own way, a kind of peace. It required no thought, no ambition, no fear. It was life reduced to motion, purpose without expectation. And in that simplicity there was dignity. The women who cleaned the same corners every day carried more patience than the men who built railways and machines. Their hands shaped not progress, but continuity. The world would have nowhere to rest when the house finally quieted for the night, and the last bit of dust settled invisible in the corners once again. There was no frustration, only a soft, knowing acceptance. The dirt would always come back, so would they. That was the agreement, ancient, unspoken, and endlessly renewed. The factory did not wake suddenly. It stirred like an enormous animal breathing in smoke. Before dawn, when the streets were still heavy with mist, the first workers arrived. Their footsteps echoed against stone walls and iron gates, soft at first, then many. Inside, the air already tasted of metal. Lamps flickered, their yellow light trembling across damp floors. Machines stood in silence for a few last moments, hulking shapes of cast iron and brass, waiting for the day to begin. Then someone pulled a lever, someone struck a match, and the world filled with sound. It began low, a slow thrum deep in the walls. Then came the click, the hiss, the rhythmic pound. Belts spun, gears locked into motion. The heartbeat of the factory began steady, relentless, unfeeling. It was not a rhythm of music, but of endurance. Every tick of the clock above the door matched the turn of a wheel below it. Time here was mechanical, not human. The workers became part of that rhythm, their bodies adjusting to the pulse of iron. Each movement, twisting, pressing, fell into the pattern. Like notes repeating in a song that had no end, the sound filled every space. It climbed the stairs, seeped into the rafters, rattled through the floors. It drowned out conversation, drowned out thought. Those who worked there did not speak much after the first hour. Their words would be swallowed by the roar. Instead, they communicated in glances, gestures, the subtle tilt of a head toward a malfunctioning part. Even laughter, when it happened, came out silent, shaped by lips, but lost to the air. The machines spoke louder than people ever could. Steam drifted in pale ribbons from the engines, mingling with dust and the scent of oil. It clung to clothes, to hair, to skin. Every surface shone faintly with sweat, human and mechanical alike. Men fed coal into furnaces, the flames lighting their faces like ghostly lanterns. Women stood beside looms, their hands moving with the speed of thought, guiding threads that never seemed to end. Children scurried between the machines, carrying bobbins or sweeping up lint. Each had a place, a rhythm, a purpose. Together, they were not individuals, but components of something vaster. Human clock powered by breath and fatigue. The factory did not rest. Its heartbeat was constant, precise, and indifferent. When a machine broke, the silence it caused was startling, almost frightening. People froze for a moment, realizing how used they had grown to the noise. The overseer's voice would cut through the pause, sharp and cold, and the hum would resume again, louder, as if to make up for the interruption. To outsiders, it might have sounded like chaos. To those inside, it was order, the only kind they knew. Light changed through the day, but little else did. The windows high above were grimed with soot, letting in only a dull gray glow. The air thickened as hours passed, warm and metallic. Sweat mixed with dust until everything smelled faintly of iron. The walls trembled faintly under the motion, as if the building itself were alive. There was no true silence here, not even at lunch, when the machines slowed. They clicked faintly even at rest, whispering their mechanical dreams. Each worker carried the factory's rhythm inside them. Even after leaving for the day, they could feel the vibrations lingering in their bones. Some said their ears rang with phantom gears at night, that they heard the hiss of steam in their sleep. It was not unpleasant, it was familiar. The factory followed them home like a memory that refused to fade. They woke with the same beat in their hearts and returned to it without question. The machine outside matched the machine within. For many, this rhythm defined existence. The factory gave structure to days that might otherwise dissolve into hunger or aimlessness. It demanded much time, strength, youth, but it offered certainty. The whistle in the morning, the whistle at night, the wages on Saturday. These were the boundaries of life. Within them, everything else could be endured. The workers did not dream of freedom so much as of small comforts: warm tea after work, shoes without holes, a roof that did not leak. The machine's promise was not happiness but survival, and that was enough. There was beauty in its own strange way within the repetition. The turning of wheels, the weaving of threads, the glow of metal fresh from the pestle had a rhythm that bordered on grace. The workers' bodies moved like choreography, not clumsy but practiced, their gestures honed to efficiency. A visitor watching from above might mistake it for dance. The hum, the motion, the breath, it was mechanical poetry, born not of joy but of persistence. Accidents happened, of course. Fingers caught, fabric torn, limbs struck by belts that moved too fast. The factory never stopped for long. Pain became part of the rhythm too, absorbed and carried on. The heartbeat did not falter for one life. It continued through gasps, through silence, through everything. Perhaps that was why it felt so powerful, because it seemed eternal, unkillable. Long after each worker was gone, the factory would still pulse, unchanged. Indifferent. Evening brought a shift in sound, not silence, but softening. The machines slowed, their clatter easing into low, worry hums. Steam sighed from pipes. The floors gleamed damp with condensation. The workers' footsteps grew louder as the noise faded, the sound of humans reclaiming their presence. One by one, they left through the heavy doors, their backs bent, their clothes marked with soot and oil. The last one out might glance back once, half expecting to see the factory still breathing. And it was. Even emptied of people, it felt alive, waiting. Its heartbeat slowed but never stopped. Outside, the fog closed in again, and the workers merged with it, disappearing down cobblestone streets. Behind them, through the tall, grimy windows, faint light still flickered over the machines. They would rest just long enough to dream of movement, before dawn came and the rhythm began again. To live in the age of industry was to live inside a pulse that never ceased, a heartbeat louder than thought, steadier than prayer. For the ordinary Victorian, that sound was both cradle and cage. It promised food and took health. It offered purpose and stole time. Yet, in that exchange, something deeply human survived. They endured. They adapted. They moved to the rhythm and became its echo. The heartbeat of the factory was not only the sound of machines, it was the sound of people learning to keep time with the modern world. Every factory had a man whose presence was heavier than the smoke, whose silence was louder than the machines. He was the overseer, the watchman of labor, the keeper of time. His footsteps were known before they were seen, the steady click of polished boots against stone floors. Workers never truly looked at him. They sensed him instead, like a draft of cold air moving through the heat. He did not shout often because he did not need to. The sound of his name was enough to straighten backs, to quicken hands, to bring the rhythm of the machines back into perfect order. He arrived early, before most. The lamps were still being lit when he walked the aisles, inspecting each row of iron beasts. He touched their metal frames as if they were soldiers under his command, ensuring they would obey. His ledger was his law, a long, worn book filled with names, hours, fines, and notes written in precise handwriting. Each mark was a judgment, each number a life measured in minutes. When the first whistle sounded, he was already watching, and when it stopped, he was still there, recording the end. He was the human clock of the factory, and his face was its unchanging dial to the workers. He was not cruel, not kind, merely constant. He existed like gravity, impossible to defy. His watch hung from his waistcoat by a thin chain, and every few minutes his fingers brushed it lightly, as if to remind the world that time belonged to him. When a machine slowed or a worker faltered, his shadow fell over them before his voice did. He would speak quietly, so that the words carried more weight than volume. "Keep the pace," he might say, and then move on. The reprimand was small, but its echo lingered longer than the noise of any engine. He walked differently from the rest. Where others hurried, he glided. Where they bent under labor, he stood straight, his coat buttoned, his boots polished. He rarely sweated, though the air was heavy with heat. There was always a calm about him, the calm of someone who watched rather than did. The workers sometimes wondered what he thought about as he paced, whether he counted or judged, or simply existed in rhythm with the machines. No one dared ask. His silence was its own authority. The overseer's office stood above the floor, a small balcony of wood and glass overlooking the sea of motion below. From there he could see everything: the spinning belts, the flicker of steam, the faint blur of hundreds of moving hands. The sound rose up to him like the roar of an ocean, endless and deep. He kept the window slightly open, so the noise would remind him that he was still part of it. On his desk sat his ledger, his lamp, and a small brass clock ticking faithfully beside them. He trusted it more than any human, more than even his own heartbeat. Sometimes, when he leaned forward against the railing, he could see the smallest details: a thread snapping, a spark from metal, a boy brushing lint from the floor. He watched it all without expression. His job was not to feel, but to maintain balance. If the rhythm of the machines wavered, he restored it. If someone fell behind, he noted it. To him, fairness meant consistency, not compassion. Every rule existed for a reason. Every punishment had its price. He believed order kept the world from falling apart, and perhaps he was right. Chaos was what the machines feared most, and he was their guardian. Yet there were moments, brief and fleeting, when the overseer hesitated. A cough too deep, a hand bandaged, two freshly small reminders that his power was not over machines, but over body. Once, he paused as a woman's sleeve caught in a wheel. The scream rose, sharp and short, then was swallowed by the noise. Others rushed to help. He did not. He simply turned and signaled for the mechanic, his face unreadable. Later, when the stretcher passed, he recorded the time in his ledger with the same precision as ever. The pen did not shake. The ink did not smear. His duty was to record, not to feel. The workers resented him quietly, but feared him more. They whispered about him at home, how his eyes could see through smoke, how his ears could hear even the softest cough over the roar of machines. Some said he had no family, that he slept in the factory itself, dreaming of gears and wages. Others imagined him rich, dining on silver plates while they ate bread by the fire. The truth was simpler. He lived alone, modestly, in a small rented room with no decoration but a single clock on the wall. It ticked too loudly in the silence, but he never wound it down. It comforted him, that sound, constant, steady, impartial, just like him, in his own way. The overseer was as trapped by the rhythm as those he watched. His life moved by the same whistles, the same hours, the same ledger lines. He too aged under the factory's heartbeat, his face hardening like the metal he oversaw. He might have dreamed once of travel, of peace, of something softer, but those thoughts had long been filed away like records of forgotten workers. What remained was precision, purpose, and the endless ticking of time. He had become what he observed, efficient, unyielding, mechanical, at the end of each day. When the last whistle blew and the machines fell silent, the overseer stayed behind. He would walk the empty aisles, the air still trembling faintly from the vibrations. He would listen to the echo of his own footsteps and the slow drip of condensation from the ceiling. The silence was almost unbearable, too wide, too heavy. For a few moments, he would stand still, watching the great machines sleep. Then, softly, he would close his ledger, hang up his coat, and extinguish the lamps one by one. The factory would exhale as the final flame died, and he would step outside into the fog, merging with it like a shadow among many. And though the workers might curse him under their breath, there was something inevitable about his presence. Without the overseer's watchful eye, the rhythm would falter, the order would dissolve, and the machine, that great creature of iron and smoke, might die. He was not its master, but its keeper. Its pulse ran through him as much as through the walls. Every life inside that building, including his, belonged to the same steady beat. And so, he kept watching, not out of cruelty, not out of choice, but because the factory never closed its eyes, and neither could he. When the great iron machines of the Victorian factory finally fell silent, it was not because they wished to rest, but because the whistle demanded it. The sound pierced through the endless clatter like a blade slicing through fog. And for the first time since dawn, the world within those sooty brick walls paused. The silence that followed was not immediate. It crept in slowly, uncertain, like a visitor unaccustomed to such a place. Workers stood where they were, their hands still trembling from the rhythm that had consumed them all morning, the air heavy with the ghost of sound. The machines, vast and glistening with oil, seemed to breathe in the sudden stillness, their metal frames ticking faintly as they cooled. A few loose belts swung lazily to a stop. Someone coughed, a long, dry sound, swallowed by the immensity of the empty air. It was lunchtime, though the word lunch felt almost grand for what it meant here. The men and women did not sit at tables. They sat on the floor or on overturned crates, their backs pressed against the walls, streaked with grease. From pockets and cloth bundles came their food, a slice of bread, a piece of cheese hardened by the cold, a small apple if they were lucky. For some, it was tea poured from a battered tin flask, its steam mingling with the pale ribbons of smoke that still drifted through the air. They did not speak loudly, for the habit of silence was too deep. The noise of the machines had trained their voices into whispers. So even now, when they could speak freely, their words came out soft and tired. The overseer, standing on his balcony above, watched the motionless rows of machinery and the scattered groups of resting workers. He did not write, not yet. His hands rested lightly on the rail, his face unreadable as he looked upon the scene below. A sea of gray coats and bowed heads under the ghostly light filtering through soot-stained windows. It was a fragile piece, and everyone knew it would not last. A few of the younger boys stretched out on the floor, using their jackets as pillows, falling into instant sleep. Their faces, smudged with dust, looked far younger in repose. Others ate quickly, their eyes half closed, as though afraid of wasting even rest. The sound that filled the factory now was different. The rustle of cloth, the creak of boots, the faint drip of condensation from the pipes above. Without the roar of gears and belts, those small sounds became vast, amplified by the emptiness. A woman's soft laughter, rare, unplanned, floated up from a corner and vanished almost at once, as if the air itself had forgotten how to carry joy. The smell of oil and smoke mixed with that of bread and weak tea, creating an odd comfort, something earthy and real. Outside, through the narrow windows, the sky was the color of ash, and the light that entered the room was gray and tired. Some of the men stepped into the courtyard for air, though there was little difference between inside and out. The same mist clung to their faces, the same soot drifted from chimneys nearby, but for a few brief minutes they could stretch, feel the stiffness in their spines, and remember that their bodies were more than extensions of machines. They spoke in low voices about wages, about children, about the weather, not because they cared deeply, but because words were the only thing that reminded them they were still human. One of them fed crumbs to a stray cat, its fur darkened by dust, its green eyes bright in the dimness. The cat purred softly, a rare sound of life amid so much iron. Back inside, the quiet had deepened into something dreamlike. Dust hung in the air, moving lazily in shafts of light. The workers' faces were soft now, almost peaceful, their eyes heavy with fatigue. For a moment, the factory seemed less like a place of labor and more like a cathedral of silence, every wall holding its breath. But time, relentless as ever, moved forward. The overseer's clock ticked with merciless precision, and the workers, though they could not see it, felt the minutes slipping away. The woman who had laughed earlier sighed and folded her breadcloth, neatly brushing crumbs from her skirt. A man drained the last sip of tea, his gaze empty but calm. The sleeping boy stirred, waking to the faint echo of footsteps. The overseer had moved again, checking the time. Without a word, the workers began to rise, stretching their arms, tightening scarves, retying aprons. The quiet hour had ended. When the whistle sounded again, it tore through the stillness like thunder. The workers did not flinch. They simply moved, a wave of motion returning to its old rhythm. The machines came alive, one after another, the belts snapping into motion, the gears clanking, the floor trembling with vibration. The heartbeat of the factory returned, strong and unyielding, erasing the fragile silence that had lived for only a moment. Yet, beneath the renewed roar, something small remained, the memory of the quiet, the taste of bread, the sound of a cat's purr, the soft warmth of an hour when the world, for once, had stopped to breathe. The overseer returned to his desk and marked the time with precision. Work resumed, 1 p.m. Then he closed the ledger softly, looked once more at the floor below, and listened as the rhythm swallowed everything again. Outside, the gray sky pressed down, and the day continued its long, slow march toward evening, as it always did and always would. When evening crept across the city of smoke, the light inside the factory began to change. The sun, though weak and distant, filtered through the high soot-streaked windows and turned the air the color of rust. Shadows grew long, stretching across the floors like dark ribbons between the silent hulks of machinery. The day's labor had not yet ended, but its weight could be felt in every motion, every breath. The workers moved slower now, their strength measured out in what little remained of daylight. You could see exhaustion settle over them like a second layer of dust. Faces once hidden by speed and routine were now visible in the fading glow pale, drawn and streaked with sweat that left lines like riverbeds through soot. The great belts still turned, but their rhythm was uneven, like a heartbeat slowing near the edge of sleep. A few lamps were lit early, their yellow flames trembling in the air, thick with steam and smoke, casting halos that seemed too fragile for such a place. The overseer walked the floor once more, not with authority now, but with the slow gait of a man measuring the end of another endless day. His footsteps no longer commanded attention. They blended with the hum of the machines, the soft hiss of air escaping from valves, the faint sigh of metal cooling. The workers barely noticed him. Their thoughts had already left this room, drifting toward home, toward the promise of bread, a small fire, and rest. In this hour, between day and night, the factory became something else, not a place of work, but a space caught between life and stillness. The noise softened, not from mercy, but from fatigue. Even the machines seemed tired, their movements slower, heavier, as if they too longed for the quiet. A woman leaned against her loom for a moment longer than she should have, closing her eyes. Her hands, still moving, did so from memory, weaving without thought. A man at the furnace straightened his back and looked toward the windows, where the dim orange light glowed faintly against the grime. He could not see the sky, only the shape of light itself, but that was enough. For a brief second, he imagined the world outside, the sound of horses in the street, the smell of damp cobblestones, the faint chatter from a pub nearby. These things felt far away, belonging to another life entirely. The whistle had not yet sounded, but the body knew when the end was near. Muscles loosened slightly. Minds wandered. A boy dropped a spool, and no one scolded him. Even the overseer let it pass. The atmosphere itself seemed to exhale, heavy with the scent of oil and tiredness. Someone began, humming just a note or two, barely audible above the soft mechanical rhythm. It was not a song anyone knew, just the instinctive sound of a soul trying to fill silence before it returned. The overseer paused, listening for a moment, and then moved on. When the final whistle came, it was softer than before, almost reluctant. The sound rose, trembled, and faded. The machines slowed, the belts sagged, the pistons came to rest. One by one, the fires were dampened. The great heart of the factory, which had beaten for 12 straight hours, ceased its pulse. What remained was a strange kind of peace, not joy, not relief, but the heavy quiet that follows survival. The workers did not cheer or speak. They simply gathered their things in silence. Boots scraped on the floor. The clink of tools echoed softly. A few coughed, their throats raw from air that had never been clean. They moved toward the exit like ghosts, their figures faint in the dim haze. Outside, the street waited dark, wet, and shimmering faintly under the weak gas lamps. The overseer stood by the door, marking the last name in his ledger as each person passed. He did not say good night. Words were unnecessary. This part of the day spoke for itself. The workers stepped into the fog, their breath rising like steam from worn coats. The cold bit at their cheeks, sharp but honest. The air outside, though polluted, felt lighter than anything within. The sound of boots on cobblestones echoed down narrow alleys as they scattered toward their home small rooms shared with families. Fires burning low, bread cooling on wooden tables. Some would talk softly before sleep. Others would say nothing at all. The silence of the factory followed them like a shadow that stretched far beyond its walls. Inside, the overseer made one final round. The factory, now empty, looked enormous, its machines motionless but not dead. The lamps burned low, and the last embers in the furnace glowed like the eyes of something ancient. Steam still curled lazily from pipes, ghostly and persistent. He stood there for a long time, hands clasped behind his back, listening to the faint creaks and sighs of metal settling. In the stillness, the place seemed almost alive, like a creature resting between dreams. He extinguished the lamps, one by one, leaving only the dim light of the furnace. The silence deepened until it was complete. The overseer turned, locked the heavy doors, and stepped into the fog, joining the invisible crowd of weary souls disappearing into the endless gray. Behind him, the factory stood alone, vast and solemn, its windows glowing faintly like eyes half closed in sleep. The night belonged to it now, the slow breath of cooling metal, the whisper of dust falling through air, the memory of motion still humming faintly in its bones. Tomorrow it would wake again, and the same rhythm would begin, as it always did, as it always would. When the factory doors opened at last, and the workers spilled out into the narrow lanes of the Victorian city, the air outside felt different, though it carried the same weight of smoke and ash that had lingered all day. The evening was cold and damp, the kind that clung to skin and clothes, settling deep into the bones. The sky above the rooftops was low and heavy, a mixture of gray and brown, the last light of day dissolving into the haze from countless chimneys. Street lamps flickered uncertainly to life, their pale orange halos trembling in the mist. For the workers, stepping into this world was both a release and a continuation of labor. The streets demanded almost as much endurance as the factory itself. Boots struck wet cobblestones, sending up tiny splashes of dirty water. Horses passed pulling carts piled high with coal or timber, their hooves muffled by mud. Children darted between them, small and thin, their laughter subdued, their faces already carrying the weary wisdom of survival. Every corner smelled of something different, bakeries exhaling the last warmth of the day, taverns leaking ale and laughter, the river at the edge of the district breathing its sour breath into the fog. Men walked in silence beside one another, too tired for talk. Women gathered their shawls tighter, their eyes lowered against the chill. The city moved like a single weary creature, thousands of hearts beating slow and heavy beneath layers of soot and shadow. In one window, a candle burned faintly behind lace curtains, a fragile sign of comfort. A child pressed her face to the glass, watching the world outside vanish into the fog, waiting for someone she hoped would return. Somewhere down the street, a man coughed harshly, the sound echoing like an old bell. The factory whistle still seemed to hum faintly in everyone's ears, its ghost impossible to silence. Even when the noise stopped, it lived inside them, every step measured to its rhythm, every breath carrying its echo. The workers passed the same shops and the same corners each night, but the city changed with the light. By day, it was alive with trade and motion. By night, it turned spectral. Gas lamps glowed through the mist like distant stars, and the streets became rivers of shadow. Sometimes you could hear the faint sound of piano music drifting from an upper window, soft and imperfect, notes that rose and disappeared like breath. For the tired souls below, that sound was both comfort and cruelty, a reminder of a world beyond their reach. The cobblestones were slick, uneven, and glistening with reflected light. A man pushing a cart called out hoarsely, his voice swallowed by the fog. Somewhere nearby, the clatter of boots and the sharp ring of a church bell reminded everyone that time continued to move, even when every part of them wished it would stop. Some workers stopped briefly at the tavern, warmth spilling from its doorway, laughter spilling from its walls. Inside, the air was thick with pipe smoke and the low hum of conversation. Coins clinked against the counter, mugs met with dull thuds. Here, the noise was human again, messy, unmeasured. Men spoke of the day's work, of a friend injured, of a rumor about wages that might rise come winter. Women sat quietly in corners, their hands wrapped around cups of tea that had long gone cold, staring into the flicker of the fire as if trying to memorize it. Outside, the fog pressed against the glass, the world beyond the door blurred and unreal. When they left again, the warmth stayed behind, and the cold returned like a waiting shadow. The streets emptied slowly, the sound of footsteps fading one by one, until only the faint drip of rain from gutters remained. Lamps burned low. The city exhaled, weary and vast. Along the river, barges creaked against the docks, ropes tightening and loosening with the current. Water slapped softly against stone, carrying reflections of dim lights that trembled on its surface. A man stood there for a while, staring into the water as if he could see through it to something better. He couldn't. Behind him, the factory loomed, its silhouette still visible against the dim horizon, tall chimneys exhaling pale ghosts into the dark. Its presence was inescapable, even from a distance. It stood like a monument to endurance, to repetition, to the strange beauty of persistence. For those who had given their day to it, the night offered little escape. They returned to narrow rooms lit by single candles, to families already asleep, to bread that tasted of effort. And yet, as they lay in their small beds, listening to the distant hum of the city, something inside them settled. The silence, heavy and imperfect, was still better than the roar. The heartbeat of the factory slowed to memory, fading under the rhythm of rain on rooftops. The world outside whispered through the fog, soft, steady, endless. And in that whisper, they found the closest thing to peace they would ever know, at least until the whistle called again. When the workers finally reached the edge of the city, where the tall chimneys ended and the small brick houses began, the night had deepened into a still, heavy thing that hung low over the rooftops. The air here was different, not cleaner, but quieter, softer, as if the noise of the factories had burned itself out before it reached these narrow streets. The fog was thin and low, crawling like a tired animal through alleys and around lampposts. Each flickering gaslight struggled to stay alive, its faint orange glow trembling against the dark. The houses leaned close together, rows of soot-stained walls, with roofs bowed slightly from years of smoke and rain. From the chimneys rose thin threads of gray that disappeared almost instantly into the night sky, which itself seemed weary from holding so much weight. The people who lived here moved slowly, not from laziness, but from the kind of exhaustion that seeps deep into the bones, the kind that no meal or sleep ever fully heals. Their boots struck softly on the cobblestones, the echo of footsteps swallowed by fog. No one spoke much on the walk home. They had already said all that needed saying in the silence of the machines. Instead, they carried their thoughts quietly, each step a small act of endurance. Inside the homes, warmth returned in fragile doses. Fires burned low in small iron grates, the orange light spilling over faces lined with soot and time. The walls were darkened from years of smoke, but they held the memories of laughter and tears and all the quiet moments in between. A pot of thin stew bubbled on a stove, its smell simple but comforting. A woman stirred it slowly, her hands moving out of habit, not thought. A man sat beside the table, still wearing his work shirt, elbows resting on his knees, staring into the fire as if it held the secret to rest. A child leaned against his shoulder, her eyes half closed, the rhythm of the flames lulling her toward sleep. These were the hours that belonged only to them, the thin slice of life between labor and dreams. There were no grand comforts here, no luxury or silence, only the fragile peace that comes from surviving one more day. In the corner, a candle flickered near a small mirror, reflecting the faintest shimmer of light. Its flame swayed as the wind pressed gently against the cracks in the window. A woman mended a torn sleeve with careful stitches. Her hands were rough, her eyes soft. Each stitch was not just repair, was hope in motion, the quiet belief that tomorrow, though it would look the same, was still worth facing. Outside, the city breathed its smoky sighs. The sound of distant wagons on the main road faded into the fog, and the faint hum of another factory's whistle echoed far away, reminding everyone that work never truly ended, only slept, waiting for dawn. Inside, the rooms were filled with the small sounds of life, the creak of the floorboards, the sigh of a settling chair, the soft murmur of a lullaby half sung, half remembered. In another room, a boy practiced his letters by candlelight, his tongue pressed to his lip in concentration, his pencil worn to the edge. His father watched silently, pride flickering in his tired eyes. The boy's world was still small, but somewhere within that smallness lay a quiet defiance, the will to know more than what the factory walls could offer. Upstairs, a baby stirred and began to cry softly, the sound fragile and human against the steady tick of the clock. The mother rose, gathering the child into her arms, whispering words too soft for anyone else to hear. The firelight danced across her face, painting her in warm gold for a moment before fading again into shadow. She rocked gently until the child's breathing slowed, and the house, once more, found its rhythm in the hush of night. Outside, the fog thickened again, rolling in from the river, wrapping itself around the street until the world seemed made entirely of smoke and silence. The lamps flickered lower, their glow shrinking, dimming, then catching again. A few last figures moved along the roadmen returning from taverns, women carrying baskets with scraps of bread. Their voices were hushed, laughter soft, as if the very air demanded quiet. Farther down, a cat slinked along a wall, pausing under a lamplight to shake the rain from its fur before disappearing into the mist. The street was alive in its stillness, every shadow a story, every breath a reminder of persistence. Back inside the homes, the fires burned to embers, their glow faint but steady. The families lay beneath patched blankets, their bodies heavy with fatigue, their dreams blurred by smoke and warmth. The mothers whispered good-night prayers. The fathers exhaled one long sigh, the kind that carried both relief and resignation. Above them, the city murmured in its sleep, the river whispering against its banks, the distant clock tower striking 10, the unseen wheels of industry still turning somewhere beyond the fog. The factory chimneys, black against the dim horizon, stood like solemn guardians, watching over those who had given their strength to them. Even now, long after the machines had gone silent, a faint hum seemed to linger in the air, the memory of motion refusing to die. But here, in these small rooms, filled with the scent of bread, coal, and faint candle smoke, something more powerful existed, the endurance of ordinary life. It was not grand or loud or written in any book, but it was the quiet pulse that kept the city alive. And as the night deepened and the last flame guttered out, the homes at the edge of the smoke became islands of warmth adrift in a sea of gray. Above them, the stars, if there were any, remained hidden behind the veil of soot. Yet somehow, even unseen, their light still reached these tired souls. Faint but faithful, promising that even through the heaviest smoke, morning would come again. When the first light of dawn began to seep through the thick veil of industrial smoke, it did not arrive as sunlight, but as a pale shimmer, a dull gray glow that bled slowly into the edges of the city. The rooftops were still wet with dew and soot, the cobblestones slick and dark beneath the new day's reluctant light. It was morning in name only. The air held the same heaviness as the night before, thick with the scent of coal, damp brick, and the faint temps of metal. The city was slow to wake, its breath uneven, its heartbeat buried beneath the sound of distant whistles. For the families who had spent the night in their narrow, close-walled homes, the return of light was both a comfort and a reminder. Another day to be endured. Another set of hours between exhaustion and survival. Inside one such house, the embers in the grate glowed weakly, the last remnants of warmth from the night. A woman rose before the others, her movements slow but practiced, her body trained by repetition. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stirred the ashes, coaxing the faint glow back into flame. The sound of the kindling catching was small but reassuring, the day's first success. The firelight crawled up the wall, revealing the faint outlines of worn wallpaper. A child's drawing pinned beside a cracked window, a kettle already waiting to be filled. Her husband stirred next, rubbing sleep from his eyes as he sat up on the edge of the narrow bed. His hands were rough, the skin along his palms cracked and blackened by work. He did not speak. He never did, not in these first quiet moments of the morning. The sound of boiling water soon filled the silence, joined by the faint rustle of cloth as the woman laid out bread that had gone hard overnight. The smell of tea and smoke mingled in the air, the scent of another beginning that looked exactly like the one before. Upstairs, children woke to the cold, shivering as they dressed. Their small voices carried down the stairwell, soft, hesitant, like birds unsure of their own song. Outside, a thin mist drifted through the street, and the lamps flickered their last breaths before being swallowed by daylight. A cart rumbled past, the horse snorting clouds of vapor into the air. Somewhere, a factory whistle cut through the quiet, sharp, metallic, and absolute. It was not merely a sound, but a command, a reminder that the city's rest had ended. The man pulled on his coat, its edges worn to threads, and stood for a moment before the fire. The warmth brushed against his face, but did not reach his eyes. He kissed his wife's forehead, a gesture that had long since become part of the morning's machinery, and stepped out into the gray street. The door closed softly behind him, leaving the house once more in that fragile peace between noise and stillness. The street was alive now, though not with joy. Men and women emerged from narrow doorways, their breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Their boots struck in rhythm on the wet stones, an unspoken march toward the factories that loomed in the distance like great sleeping beasts waiting to be fed. The sound of the river mixed with the hum of the waking city, the clatter of wheels, the bark of a dog. Children followed their parents part way, clutching their hands before turning toward schools or errands, the day's first separations playing out in silence. The light grew stronger, but never golden. It was a tired, washed-out gray that revealed everything without illuminating it. On the walls, soot formed patterns, like ghosts of old smoke, stains that no amount of scrubbing could remove. The smell of baking bread from a nearby shop drifted faintly, almost sweet, almost enough to make one believe in comfort. Inside the factories, the fires were already burning again. Steam hissed through pipes. Pistons began to move. Belts turned and tightened. The day's rhythm resumed, relentless, mechanical, indifferent. Outside, the city adjusted to its own noise, the slow murmur of life returning to motion. By mid-morning, the streets were once again filled with the soft haze of industry, the sunlight long since swallowed by the rising smoke. A few women gathered near doorsteps, exchanging quiet greetings as they hung damp clothes on lines strung between windows. The air smelled of soap and soot, of work and weather. Time seemed to move differently here, not forward, but in circles, looping endlessly around the same hours, the same chores, the same breaths drawn and released. Yet within that sameness, there was still something human, something that refused to die. A child's laughter echoed from an alleyway, sudden and clear. A cat stretched in the morning chill. A man paused to tie his boot, glancing up at the faint outline of the sun through the haze, as if to make sure it still existed. The city, though heavy with its own burden, carried on with quiet dignity. And when the whistle blew again at noon, marking the passage of hours, it sounded not like an intrusion, but like the steady pulse of life itself. For those who lived at the edge of the smoke, the morning was never bright, but it was enough, a reminder that after every night of labor, there was always this gray light waiting, patient and familiar, to guide them back into the world once more. By the time the morning turned fully to day, the rhythm of the city had settled into its familiar, grinding pulse, a steady hum of wheels, footsteps, and the sighing breath of steam rising from the countless chimneys that stitched the skyline together. The air was heavy, thick enough to taste, and every sound seemed dulled beneath it, as though wrapped in layers of smoke. The workers had already vanished into the vast bellies of their factories. Swallowed by brick and iron, the streets, once full of motion, now felt empty in their absence. The silence broken only by the slow creak of carts and the cawing of crows perched on blackened rooftops. Inside the factory walls, the day unfolded like an echo of every day before it. The great machines stirred to life, their rhythm relentless, their power almost alive. Belts spun, gears turned, and the floor trembled faintly under the weight of labor. The workers moved through this world of noise and dust like ghosts, their faces pale beneath layers of grime. The air shimmered faintly with heat and the metallic temps of oil. It was a strange kind of music, one made not for pleasure but for endurance, a hymn of survival, sung by hands instead of voices. Each movement was deliberate, efficient, practiced. A man lifted a beam and wiped his brow. A woman adjusted a loom, her fingers nimble and scarred. A boy carried coal, his small frame swallowed by shadow. The day had no mercy, only motion. Hours blurred into one another, marked not by clocks, but by muscle memory, by the ache that grew in arms and backs, by the dull ringing in ears that refused to fade. Outside, the world carried on without noticing, horses trotting past, shopkeepers sweeping their doorsteps, schoolchildren reciting lessons beneath windows streaked with soot. But within the factories, time belonged to the machines. It was measured in output, in breath, in the number of turns a wheel made before the whistle sounded again. There was beauty here, if one looked closely enough, not in the elegance of design, but in the quiet persistence of those who endured it. Every bead of sweat that rolled down a brow was a kind of testimony. Every sigh that escaped between clenched teeth was proof of life refusing to be crushed completely by iron. At midday, a brief pause came, not rest, but reprieve. The machines fell silent, the air suddenly still. The workers stepped outside into the pale daylight, blinking as though waking from a dream. The sky was barely visible through the gray, but its faint glow was enough to remind them that the world beyond still existed. Some sat along the walls, eating bread and drinking water from tin cups. Others simply stood, faces tilted upward. Conversations were rare. Words felt heavy, unnecessary. The silence among them was not loneliness, but a shared understanding, the communion of those who carried the same invisible weight. A few laughed quietly, the sound brittle but real. Then, as quickly as it had come, the pause ended. The whistle shrieked again, and the tide turned inward. The day continued its slow, endless crawl. By afternoon, the light outside had begun to dim, though the sun was still high behind the smoke. Inside, the air grew thicker, harder to breathe. The workers' movements slowed, their exhaustion visible in the small hesitations of muscle and motion. Still, no one stopped. They had learned long ago that to stop was to invite notice, and notice meant questions, and questions meant consequences. So they pressed on, hour after hour, until even thought dissolved into repetition. The machines sang their metallic hymn, and the people answered with silence. Beyond the walls, the city's rhythm never faltered. The streets filled once more with sound carts rattling, children shouting, vendors calling out prices for bread and fish. Life, in its stubborn, unpolished form, continued. The factories were its lungs, and the workers its heartbeat. When the day began to wane, and the light outside took on that familiar copper tint, the hum of machinery deepened into a final crescendo. The floor trembled one last time. The air grew hotter, then suddenly still. The whistle sounded again, long, drawn-out, weary. For a moment, the silence that followed felt immense, almost sacred. The workers stood where they were, blinking through the haze, their minds catching up to the realization that the day was finally over. Slowly, they laid down their tools, wiped their hands, and began the slow walk toward the doors. The air outside hit them like water, cold, sharp, and real. The sky above was bruised with dusk, the smoke rising from the chimneys, glowing faintly orange in the fading light. Their footsteps echoed through the narrow streets, soft and steady, carrying the weight of another day survived. And though tomorrow would come just the same, there was something quietly triumphant in that simple act of walking home, as though, in facing the endless repetition, they had somehow won. When the final whistle faded and the light sank beneath the fog-choked skyline, the city seemed to sigh long and deep, as though exhaling the weariness of another endless day. The streets that had been alive with motion only hours before now softened into silence. The air, still heavy with smoke and coal dust, cooled slowly, wrapping itself around the rooftops and lampposts like a great gray blanket. From every factory, the last curls of steam drifted upward, dissolving into the twilight as the fires below were dampened. It was the hour between labor and rest, between noise and stillness, when even the river seemed to flow more quietly. The workers emerged again into this dim, breathing world, their shadows long and thin in the lamplight. Their faces were unreadable, neither joy nor despair, only the familiar expression of endurance, the muted satisfaction of having reached the end of something that would begin again tomorrow. Their boots struck the cobblestones in slow rhythm, 1,000 tired steps that echoed like raindrops in the fog. Above them, the gas lamps flickered, their faint halos bending and stretching through the mist. Every window they passed glowed faintly with the yellow light of candles and small fires, each one a tiny refuge in the vast industrial sprawl. The city at night was a different creature, softer, quieter, almost kind. The relentless hum of machinery was gone, replaced by the occasional creak of a wagon wheel or the far-off bark of a dog. The air carried a different scent now, a mix of damp earth, bread baking in distant ovens, and the faint sweetness of burning wood. The people moved without speaking, not from gloom, but from the deep fatigue that made speech unnecessary. In this shared silence, they found a strange companionship, an understanding deeper than words. A few turned toward the taverns, their dimly lit doorways spilling warmth and laughter onto the cold street. Inside, mugs clinked softly, and the murmur of voices rose and fell like a tide. It was not celebration, exactly, more like the gentle hum of life refusing to go quiet. Others went straight home, drawn by the faint glow of windows where wives and children waited at the edge of the district. The streets narrowed further, twisting into thin lanes lined with identical brick houses. The smoke here hung low, turning every lamplight into a small sun. A woman leaned out of a doorway to shake a rug. Another poured water from a jug, steam rising from the chill. From somewhere came the sound of a lullaby, soft and almost lost in the fog. The workers turned, one by one, into their streets, the crowd thinning until only a few figures remained. Inside the homes, fires were coaxed back to life. Coats were hung, boots left by the door. A table was laid with bread and broth. The faint clatter of spoons echoed softly against the quiet. In one house, a man sat by the hearth, his hands still black with soot. He did not wash yet, he simply stared into the flames, letting their warmth remind him that he was still alive. A child crawled into his lap, half asleep, the smell of smoke clinging to both of them. The man smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes not from joy but from peace. The hours passed slowly, and the city sank deeper into itself. From above, the rooftops looked like a sea of gray waves, chimney smoke drifting upward in soft plumes. The factory towers stood silent now, their windows dark, their great engines cooling in the dark. Yet even in stillness, they seemed alive, resting giants waiting for morning. Down below, the last lights winked out one by one. The laughter from the taverns dwindled to a hum, then to nothing. The sound of footsteps faded, leaving only the steady rhythm of rain beginning to fall. Soft at first, then heavier, tapping against windows and cobblestones alike. It washed over the city like a lullaby, blurring the outlines of everything, the houses, the streets, even the people inside. The rain mingled with soot, tracing thin black rivers along the gutters, cleansing nothing but changing everything in the smallest hours of the night. When even the taverns were silent and the last lamps had gone out, the city finally slept. The factories, the workers, the cobblestones, the river, all of it seemed to breathe in unison, slow and deep. A kind of peace, rough-edged but real, settled over everything. The workers dreamed not of escape but of stillness, a morning without whistles, a sky without smoke, a breath drawn clean. Somewhere, a clock struck midnight, its chime distant but clear. The sound floated through the fog and over the rooftops, marking not the end of the day but the quiet endurance of life continuing in its steady, weary rhythm. And though the dawn would come soon enough, bringing with it another round of labor, another tide of motion and noise, for now the city belonged to the silence, vast, gray, and tender. Beneath the shroud of smoke and rain, London slept, not peacefully, but faithfully, the way only a tired city can. Its dreams were made of soot and steam and the faint glow of candlelight. And in that endless grayness, something human, fragile but unbroken, continued to breathe.